Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that you are all doing well. I have a very special guest with me today, and we are discussing I believe this is your first book, right?
First book for a popular non-academic audience.
Well, there you go. Anyways, writing any kind of book or anything lengthy is always an accomplishment, but I am joined by Senior Fellow at the Claremont Institute, Mr. Jeremy Carl. How are you, sir?
I'm great. Pleasure to talk again, and look forward to chatting.
Yes, absolutely. We are, of course, discussing, as the title would tell you, his upcoming book, The Unprotected Class. And we're going to be diving into that fully to begin with. And it'll be available to you on April 23rd, correct?
That is correct, and I'm not sure when this episode will end up dropping, but probably somewhere pretty close to then. So feel free to order now, and it will show up magically by April 23rd if you do so.
There you go. Yes, The Unprotected Class, How Anti-White Racism is Tearing America Apart. So you can find that at any popular bookseller of your choosing. I always recommend physical media. I will be purchasing a physical copy myself, even though Mr. Carl was kind enough to give me sort of a review copy to look ahead and to discuss these things. So I guess the first question I wanted to begin with is the title itself, The Unprotected Class. I presume that this is directly in relation to how we talk about protected classes and groups in America's sort of civil rights regime and legal reasoning, right?
Yeah, that's correct. And in fact, when I originally did it, and I think you're sort of more on the alternative side of my reader, so you'll appreciate this, and so will your viewership. Um, I had originally wanted to call it "It's Okay to Be White," and I fought with my publisher about that, and I actually got them to agree to do that. And then the salespeople kind of came back and said, "Nah, we're not going to be able to sell that to Costco and wherever else." And I really do want this message going out, and so we changed it to this sort of more academic title, "The Unprotected Class." And yes, it does, as you've correctly pointed out, refer to civil rights law. We have this we have this category in civil rights law that we call protected classes, and that can be around anything. It can be around disability, it can be around sex, it can be around a lot of other things, but the most common thing is race. And the sort of irony here, that I'm sure some sniping left-wing critic of my book will point out, is that in theory, white people are actually a protected class by race under civil rights law. But in practice, that's not how it works at all. In fact, white people are kind of a denigrated class, and it's just now through the very kind of stellar work of folks like America First Legal out in DC, Stephen Miller's operation, that we're beginning to get some of the first successful lawsuits that are kind of pointing out some of the really blatant anti-white discrimination and racism that is going on within the system, stuff that's just patently illegal but has never really been challenged to this point.
Yeah, and I was going through and I was reading through it earlier this morning as sort of show prep, sort of give away the audience as to when we're recording this. But I noticed that a lot of the comments included there were recently from the GOP debate stage for the 2024 primary. You had Vivek Ramaswamy's remarks about the Great Replacement. You had mentioned numerous bits from Hollywood and the blatant, sort of anti-white animus that you'll see in a lot of commercials and television. It felt very fresh, which is always good when you're writing these sort of texts that you want to feel like you have your finger on the pulse, and I would certainly say that you do. So I guess the first question I do want to ask you, with all of the chapters that I was going through, the table of contents, going through 3 chapters in particular, for someone like myself or the readership, or also some of our general Twitter mutuals, would look at this and say, well, yeah, I pretty much agree with all this. Like, this is definitely the case. But what would you say is the main point of writing this book, and what decided now of all times to go ahead and make that publication?
Sure. Well, I'm glad you asked that. So there's a few different ways that I kind of go about answering it. And the first is kind of the audience for this is dual. I think for your most edgelord listeners, and I say this because I have given this to the book to a few folks like this, they will learn a number of new things that they did not know from reading this book. On the other hand, and this kind of gets to why I wrote the book, it's also the sort of book that they could go to their normie con mom and dad and give them this book with this very provocative thesis and feel like this is done responsibly enough that it's not going to scare the hose, as we say. I mean, it's not going to scare mom and dad. It's not going to scare whatever normie friend you want to give it to. They'll be able to look and they'll be like, wow, this is a very provocative subject, but I went overboard to make it a just the facts, ma'am type approach,
Hmm.
and not to. I mean, the race ipsa loquitur, the thing itself speaks. I mean, I didn't need to kind of go overboard with a bunch of rhetoric, and in fact, I think one of the useful things that my editors did when I was kind of working on it was the few times that I did get a little bit worked up about something that was happening, we kind of actually went out and kind of killed that, because that's not the point. I don't need to gild the lily here. I don't need to. The facts in itself are damning enough. And why I wrote it now, I'd really been wanting to write this book for several years. I started writing it almost 2 years ago, although I'm glad that you do think it's fresh. I did try to kind of keep up as we were going through edits with, oh yeah, I'm going to put this piece in because this is current. So, it does go up through the GOP debates and things like that. But it was a little bit like, without implying any personal comparison, God going to Moses and saying, hey, I want you to lead my people. And Moses is like, gosh, I'm slow of speech, go get somebody else. And finally God says, shut up and just go do it. And by the way, I'm going to get your brother Aaron, who's a little bit more glib, to help you out. But I kept hoping somebody else was going to write this book, because when you write a book like this, there's inevitably blowback. And I've got a family and everything like that. I'm not unused to kind of getting hits, but I didn't really want to do that. But at a certain point, I was like, actually, no, I guess I need to write it because nobody else will. And it's not, of course, that other people haven't done things on similar topics, or that they haven't done subsets of this. In fact, as I point out in the book, this is a survey course, okay? I mean, we have seen books that look at these subjects, but they're just looking at one of the subjects that I'm kind of getting at. And what I'm trying to sort of show is, I wanted to put the word white front and center, because a lot of times you'll see writers, even really brave and well-intentioned writers, they'll kind of talk about wokeness or things like that, and they kind of dance around like what's really at stake and the group that's really being kind of hit here. And I didn't want to do that. And the other thing I wanted to do is, I sort of felt like in writing these single subject books, we had a lot of people kind of being the proverbial blind man touching the elephant, and they're each touching a different part of it. And what I wanted to go in and say is, actually, the elephant's an elephant, and all of this stuff is interrelated. And we need to talk about why it's interrelated and why these sorts of attacks are going on, and then figure out what we can do to address it.
Yeah, absolutely. And anyone who purchases this book, whether you are, say, more tuned into Frog Twitter, or like you had said, you're kind of trying to make this bridge between where these talking points for the longest time have been sort of relegated towards the edges or more alternative parts of the mainstream right, or just not even within the mainstream period, and bringing it in. I think that you lay it out very clearly. I mean, the lay of the land, I'm reading off just the table of contents here. I mean, you're going through civil rights, our anarcho-tyranny, our neighborhoods, schooling, erasure, monuments, entertainment, big businesses, everything. Like you said, you've got all the parts of the elephant there. And then you head towards the end here, with, of course, sort of what the end game would look like. I mean, there's a lot of debates over what the world looks like, or what it might look like if this continues. People like to say, South Africanization. Other people like to say it's going to be more like Terry Gilliam's Brazil.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a lot of ways in which America could go very much either one of those paths, maybe a little mix of both. But to you, both as someone who, and I've had you on before, we've talked about where are the policy wonks, where are the people that are trying to look at consultants, businesses, and academics for government. Where do you see, the path forward as we outline this clear and present danger to the American identity, the American nation, and our entire history of jurisprudence in America? I mean, what for you? I mean, you've given me your reason for putting this book out, but what is your proposed solution, if you have one? Or I mean, or is
Sure.
this more of a warning call to the people, right, to do not worship the golden calf that is like the
Right.
anti-white legal infrastructure?
Right. Well, as a dissident in your space would say, we're only given white pills here. So No, I'm not trying to be black-pilled in this book. I'm not trying to say, hey, this really sucks and there's nothing we can do about it and we should just all give up and isn't that bad? America was a nice idea. Not at all. I mean, I think that we've got some challenges, and if I'm strictly honest with you and your listenership, I'm probably ending on a little bit more of an optimistic note than I think I really have, because I think those challenges are really sobering and they're not going to be easy to solve. At the same time, I don't think in any way, not only do I not think the South Africanization of the US is inevitable, I don't think it's likely at all. Now, the Brazilianization, maybe. And I've been in Brazil. It's not the worst place in the world, but it's certainly not the US, and it's not consistent with what we built here over centuries. But having said that, I do think that there are things we can do, and I suggest a number of them in my conclusions. And some of them are sort of informal, and one of them I kind of suggest primary among those informal ones is that essentially what I call white shifting, and I'm borrowing from Eric Kaufman, who's an academic who's written a lot about these issues. But it's you could easily just maybe slightly less provocatively call it sort of ethnogenesis of a new American identity that is kind of fundamentally rooted in America's white European heritage, but is not necessarily ethnically completely exclusive. And the obvious group that you can grab for a lot of this is Hispanics. And I discuss in my book, and you kind of appreciate this where you live because you have a lot of this. In fact, I was just down in Texas, and particularly in San Antonio, I really saw a lot of this. But Hispanics who have a lot of history, that even going back before the U.S. was a country. Again, you go down to San Antonio, that have both ethnic affinity and certain cultural affinities, particularly if they've been here multi-generational with America's kind of white founding stock, if you will. But I think also just any number of multiracial people. It could be multiracial Asians, multiracial African Americans, whatever, but people who kind of want to identify with the majority historical traditional American culture, kind of building that and creating over time, when you combine it with a net zero immigration policy that I also offer as something that is a core thing of what we could be doing. This allows us to kind of create a new American ethnos that would really look back with pride on our history and culture. And I get that for certain people on the furthest reaches of the right who kind of have fantasies of sort of some pure ethno state, that's not going to necessarily appeal to them. But I think my keyword I would give them as a rejoinder is I think that those are ultimately fantasies. And one of the things that I do, I don't spend really hardly any time in this book punching right. But the only time I could arguably do it in a little bit, and I do it sincerely there, is that I think there's a little bit of a hide the ball that happens with some of the further reaches of the right, where they say, oh, well, I want this white ethno state in America, but they don't really discuss how you're going to get there. And the reality is that unless you do something that I'm approaching, which is kind of an Americanist ethno state, a white ethno state of any type is going to involve violence, a lot of violence, and is not something that I'm signing up for or that I think anybody else should be signing up for. So I suggest sort of a more practical Americanization plan. And I do think to kind of give the due to the folks on the further reaches of the right, I think that has to be combined with really cracking down on illegal immigration and legal immigration. Because I think if you don't do that, then you're kidding yourself about what you're Americanizing people into. So I'm happy to get very tough on deporting folks and et cetera. But I sort of start there. I also start with, I think we need to fundamentally relook at civil rights laws and reconceptualize them, redo them in some pretty fundamental ways. And I think that means not just getting rid of affirmative action, which is low-hanging fruit to me, but really going back and kind of fundamentally relooking at these things. And I don't think that means, I don't need to relitigate the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I think you can make arguments that it was the appropriate blunt instrument that maybe we needed at the time to kind of have equal rights for the whole variety of citizens. But the reality is we've long since passed the point where I think whatever benefits accrued as a result of that the costs have piled up and the benefits have not piled up. We are as remote from the day that was passed as they are to the Wright brothers. 60 years in between both of those. We need a different set of tools to ensure equal opportunities for Americans. And I think we need to acknowledge that basically whatever the Civil Rights Act advantages it had in the early 1960s, it's fundamentally turned with the administrative state into kind of a tool of anti-whiteness. And so we just need to acknowledge what it's doing now, and we need to kind of fundamentally reconceptualize how we're going to deal with those issues. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question, but those are some of the things I'm thinking about.
And I've noticed that that's where the conversation really has been going, and sort of I mean, even for people that want to give maybe some more of my fellow travelers, for lack of a better term, that may want to criticize Rufo or others, I think that one of the things that has definitely been pointed out is that you may not need to go back to something pre-1964, at least in 2024, but you can definitely get the pre-1964 world back in ways of simply undoing a lot of the administrative and the legal decisions that come out of this. And I mean, one of the earliest things I ever worked on was talking about the slippery slope. And you look at the arguments that were raised against, the Griswold decision versus Connecticut about the use of contraception within the private domiciles of homes with this invented right to privacy. And one of the few objections in that case was, well, couldn't this legal right to privacy be used for an abortion? And this was 10 years before the decision that would inevitably lead to Roe v. Wade. And we've noticed the same thing happen here with civil rights law and everything. I've noticed that you cited Caldwell's Age of Entitlement, which is a fantastic read. I think that's another great book that anyone, anonymous or, well presenting or in face showing like ourselves would definitely take advantage of and appreciate. I guess one of the things that in that long, your answer to that, I think one of the questions that might come up would be, what specifics? Because to me, I think one of the most important ones, and I'm glad that you really talk about this book in your book, is freedom of association, because that has been utterly obliterated. And, that again, that goes back to the legal jurisprudence of it all, is that, people ask the question all the time, well, why can't we have a competent business or flights or anything like that? And people tell, and they'll tap the sign and tell you, well, that's illegal. And here's why. Right. And so, if you want to outline some more on the freedom of association, because that is one of the biggest, I think, hamstrings that gets pulled on the most about American societies, is that we can't freely associate, especially for whites, is that, as much as people like to talk about pointing out hypocrisy, I think everyone kind of knows that it is very much legally designed for us versus them in an anti-white context, that there are allowed to be covenants, groups, fraternities that are explicitly racial, explicitly homogenous for everyone, but the majority demographic of the country that is treated to be the default American.
Right. And I, by the way, I'd also just highlight the whole problem, and there are many, many problems with it morally and practically, but you just touched on a really key word, which is majority. Well, it isn't going to be even the majority for that much longer, for better or for worse, unless, again, we do some sort of dramatic ethnogenesis and reconceptualization. So these things are problematic enough in and of themselves, but when whites are just another, leaf of lettuce in the tossed salad, then it's really, really problematic. So we do need to restore freedom of association. And I'm not an expert in the underlying areas of law here, so I don't want to get too nerdy, but I think the way I think about it and kind of write about it in the book is to say, at least conceptually, where we want to be is, look, I think we understand that for certain public goods that are provided by the government, those really need to be done as much as possible without fear or favor. That's just kind of the reality of what governmental service provision leads. But for privately provided goods, I think where you get back freedom of association, I kind of cite the example of the bake me a cake guy, because I think it's really been one of the biggest abuses of this. And as Christian conservatives, as I know we both are as well, you appreciate this, right? Um, this baker in Colorado who has been endlessly kind of harassed, not even because he won't bake a cake for gay people, right? Which I actually think he should be within his rights not to do. Um, but that he won't bake a cake celebrating a gay wedding because it violates his conscience rights. So my kind of view on how I think we want to at least think about this is to say, look, people have a right to the provision of services in general, even in the private sphere. But if you're going to sue me legally and say you're discriminating against me and there's some sort of a legal case, what you should have to show is that I couldn't have gotten a comparable product or service from anyone elsewhere that would prove some sort of undue burden on me. And that makes all the cases like this cake case go away, because there were a million bakers who would have been happy in that same area to bake that same cake. And the the person who the cake baker is really the victim here. It's not the kind of radical gay activist who's pursuing it. So I think you take that same thing to race and you have that same type of burden of proof. By the way, when saying that, just so that when the SPLC is monitoring our podcast, I want to eliminate this gotcha. We're not going to have in 2024 America, for the most part, people do things in an overtly racially exclusive way. That's not what this is about. What it's about is not having somebody be able to go in and say, well, you don't have enough of this group, or you don't have this type of people, or you turned away these person and you said it was because they're rowdy, but actually I can show there's some sort of racially disproportionate impact going on. That's what we're going to likely get as a result of changing the burden of proof here. And what we can just say is, sorry, go away. It's our business. This person could get these sorts of services somewhere else, and we get to run our business or our club or whatever else on the way that we like. And it may not match perfectly with the population demographics of this neighborhood or whatever, but you know what? That's fine. It's a free country. It's America. We should have the right to do that.
Well, maybe I might want to push back a little on maybe perhaps explicit racial motivations. I mean, we've just noticed earlier this week, at the time of this recording, it is March 27th. But just 2 days ago, there's reporting from CBS News in Boston that racial justice leaders are demanding support from white churches and $15 billion
yeah.
from the city of Boston, specifically saying that we are coming for our check.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think it's very clear that you have a legal system and a sort of social. And I mean, the entertainment chapter in your book I thought was very excellent, because it does highlight that there is there's the idea of cultivation theory. What we see on television is now going to be how we perceive our reality. This is how Americans can overestimate how many gay people are in the United States, or they'll say like, oh, 1/5 of the country is gay, when it's a statistically much smaller position. But it does indicate that there is a huge amount of pressure that says that, like, this is the one group in America that is okay to basically rob blind through the judicial process of the system. And I think that it's sort of important to consider that no, there are some very explicit racial animus that is predicated, if not outright state sponsored, by numerous municipalities and parts of our federal government. And I think that one of the things I noticed in your solutions towards the end is, of course, you have to dismantle the administrative state, because I tell people all the time, and I'm sure you've seen this clip as well, and if you haven't, I really recommend that you look it up. The most honest 5 minutes I've ever seen anyone in the United States House of Representatives or Senate ever say was former Senator Ben Sass back during the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. And he had basically said, Congress has abandoned its ability to legislate, it writes shell pieces of legislation, and the administrators become the rule of law. And the last avenue for politics in America is the Supreme Court, which is why SCOTUS has been so politicized over the last 50 years. And I think it's sort of important to indicate that unless you can dismantle the whole elephant, as this book does highlight, I think that you're not going to stop the sort of mentality of, well, pay up or else.
Right. Yeah, I actually don't disagree with anything you just said, and so maybe I didn't express myself
Okay.
clearly enough. It's not that, of course, I saw this thing in Boston with the churches. I talk about reparations as actually being very fundamental to the left's underlying strategy here. I think fundamentally it actually undergirds everything they do. It's why we're seeing all this, whether they call it reparations or anything else. They essentially want to do resource transfers from white Americans to other groups. That's so no argument there that they're going to do certain things that will be explicitly racial. What I was trying to say is that in 2024, I think the number of clubs or groups or businesses that are going to put up some sign saying no Hispanics allowed is like, I don't want to say it's zero, but it's asymptotic to zero. Okay.
Hmm.
But what you are going to have is some group or club that may set membership requirements, whatever else, that are going to have what we would call a disparate impact or a racially disproportionate or whatever disproportionate type of thing, where right now a malicious person can use civil rights law to say, well, you're discriminating. And what we need to be able to do is to reconceptualize the law to say, hey, go jump in a lake, right? Like it's just not your business. And we're going to have the people in our club or in our group or serving in our business who we want to. And again, I think this is very unlikely in 99.99% of cases to be something that is going to be explicitly racial on our end. But there are things that may have some sort of implicit racial component to it, not even necessarily intentionally. And what we want to do is to give away, get rid of the left's attempts to be able to do lawfare based on that sort of thing.
Mm. Well, I would definitely agree with that. I think even the most explicitly, pro-white organizations, I think, outside of just flat out saying that what they are is what they are, I think most people won't operate overtly in maybe a racial connotation. I think because
Yeah,
everyone is afraid of the, civil rights division of the D is the perpetual sword of racial
yeah,
Damocles in America, at least especially for whites more than anyone else. I mean, of course, Asians and others are definitely going to be included in that regard. But one of the things that maybe this I can also poke your brain at as we sort of talk about solutions and sort of the leviathan that is sort of this administrative, legal, and social and political pressure on sort of the dwindling majority demographic in America would be that. Outside of just the legal aspect, I mean, because that's a big aspect of this. I am a believer that if you do change the law, people start kind of getting in tune with what the power of the law is, but that requires it to have teeth. Do you see a change in culture? Do you see an opportunity to where if we were to start enacting said policies or start doing things even on a local or state level, that you might see a change in culture because everyone kind of knows, whether it be between video game studios like Activision and Infinity War, that they talk to the U.S. military. Hollywood has connections to the United States
right.
government. Are you going to see a change in sort of cultural pressure as well? Because I am skeptical, just because as America continues to be more diversified and less white, as that's what diversity really does mean these days. That
Absolutely.
what where are you going to where do you see cultural shifts changing? Because legal
Yeah.
shifts would be fantastic. It's still, you have generations and generations of people, like you talk about in your chapter about statues and education, and the fact that there are people now being educated in our public school system that have no connection to the founders whatsoever. How do you get them to appreciate a culture or a history that, for all intents and purposes, they have no connection to?
Yeah. I mean, you raised a number of really good points there, and one of which I want to really harp on because it's important. I thought a lot about whether I wanted to use the word racism in the title. And
Hmm.
there's a variety of thought on the right, and I'm sure you're and probably a lot of your viewers are familiar with, on even kind of using the word racism, period, or whether that's almost coded in an anti-white way. That wasn't dispositive to me, but whether I wanted to use a word like discrimination instead of racism. And I think I ended up choosing to use the word racism for the reason that I do think one area where I think I differ a little bit with like the Richard Hananias of the world who came out with a book recently is I don't see it all coming back to civil rights law.
Hmm.
Civil rights law is really important, but one of the things that I talk about in the book is a lot of this is informal cultural things that are going on. So in Hollywood, most of the things, some of the things that they do are just probably should be illegal. Um, but a lot of it is just like, hey, it's black, it's black Eliza Doolittle, or
Yeah.
it's black Queen Elizabeth, right? That shouldn't be illegal, but we should question it. It certainly we wouldn't have that sort of thing go the other way in the year 2024. So there are times in which I'm really addressing formal legal discrimination, and at times I'm addressing more informal things going on. And as you point out, the challenge we have, and one of the reasons why I'm very hardcore on the immigration question and have been for a long time, is it's very hard when you bring in people who, by their background, don't have any connection to the historic American nation and try to say, hey, this is your story too. Now, there are some who will absolutely embrace that, right? Like, and you see that. And a lot of those guys tend to be the minority Republicans today, who kind of say, hey, this can be our story. It is something that can expand to include us. And obviously, over time, I think as they marry into perhaps the majority or historic majority white culture, then that becomes their story. So I do think it can happen, right? The example I always like to choose, I mean, Barack Obama is descended from slave owners, but not slaves in America. Barack Obama could have chosen to kind of identify with his white ancestry, which I believe goes back almost to the Pilgrims, rather than his African ancestry when his African father abandoned him. Now, I understand enough about racial politics in the US where I can kind of be a little sympathetic with why he maybe chose not to do that. But I think partially our culture is also telling him not to do that. And I think it's interesting that he has a brother who I believe lives in China, who essentially kind of is like, Barack, WTF, like, why are you doing this? Why are you like so obsessed with this black identity when your African dad abandoned you? Um, so I do think those things could go in another way, but we need a very aggressive Americanization strategy for the immigrants and descendants of immigrants that we do have here. And again, in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, even in the mid 20th century, America had the cultural confidence to insist on that. And today, unfortunately, I think we don't. And I think that's a tragedy.
Well, I think a lot of that cultural confidence would also emerge from the fact that there was sort of a aggressive racial majoritarian culture. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you cite Theodore Roosevelt, and of course he was, as you quoted and cited. I mean, he was influenced by the immigrant, playwright and story about the melting pot. But I mean, also at the same time, Theodore Roosevelt was an adamant defender that the idea that democracy was the ultimate way to win racial competition for
Yeah.
what he identified as the white world, and at least for white Americans. And there doesn't seem to be an aggressive confidence, or even if you want to call it chauvinism to some critics about it, that doesn't seem to exist. I mean, the for instance, I recently watched a film and I reviewed it on a show of mine called The Iron Claw, and it's about a wrestling family. But I mean, I was surprised that film even got made in 2023 because it's about an all-white family and an all-white sort of part of the world in the wrestling world in the 1970s and 80s. And you're just thinking to yourself, wow, it's impressive that it was even made in that respect. And there's no sort of confidence for that to emerge. And I think that one of the important things to consider, and you do talk about it in your book, is about having the confidence to say that this is who we are and this is what we do. I think that's what's attracted people to Trump so much. And I mean,
Sure.
it's a big thing too when you mentioned Hispanics as well. I mean, I know some of my more further to the right or more critical friends of these issues, they might say, well, there's still big differences. And that what I would agree with. But you look at the 2020 election. I mean, the Rio Grande Valley swung to the red for Republicans for the first time ever, really, when
Right.
it comes to Texas politics. And we talk about sort of American ethnogenesis. I think of Scott Greer's discussion with Daryl Cooper
Which was
and
great.
Lafayette Lee. It was a great discussion, and
Yeah.
I agreed with a lot of points made by everyone. But I think Greer made a very good point that you can be sort of almost chauvinistic in your confidence about being a quote unquote like pro-white, pro-historical American attitude, as long as you address the issues of the day, which of course the issues of the day are going to be immigration, a stagnant economy, and that we are literally implementing policies for diversity, equity, and inclusion that I would just basically flat out label a national security threat. I mean,
Sure.
and you talk about that in your book as well. I mean, just when we can't build things because we have these requirements to hire unqualified people for basis of race or whatever, and we can't build a semiconductor, fab plant, what are we doing? Like
Yeah.
we're shooting ourselves with one foot and telling ourselves to walk on it for another 50 miles.
Yeah.
It's impossible.
No, that's absolutely true, I think there's lawfare again is a key component I mentioned. I think we need to ramp up the lawfare on our side 1,000x from where we are. I
Mhm.
think Stephen Miller is kind of showing just how many $20 bills were lying on the ground that we weren't picking up. But we need 15. We don't need 15. We need like 200 other firms kind of pursuing this stuff. And I think at a point at which it becomes painful for the anti-white racists on the left to continue to racially discriminate, that's when they'll stop, and not a moment before, and not because we have area appeals to the Constitution or area appeals to history. There needs to be, and I talk about this in the book, mutually assured destruction. I'll point out, you mentioned I talk about Roosevelt in the book, and you referenced Roosevelt, something that even a lot of your most dissident listeners will not know of. I will throw out a little bone to them here. There's a book that I believe is edited by Elliot Roosevelt, who was one of his sons. I mean, it's definitely by one of his sons. I just can't remember whether it's Elliot, who was a member of the John Birch Society and a real hardcore right winger. And he lists it's basically a collection of I think it's kind of, I'm getting this name right but wrong, but it's roughly TR on Reds, riots, race, and crime. And it came out again. It was published by the John Birch Society in the 1960s. Really, really difficult to get a copy today. Not even online. I eventually tracked one down on eBay, but it's basically just Eliot collecting his father's speeches and excerpts and showing that the original TR was an extremely right wing based Chad, as if you will, on all these sorts of issues, and really said a lot of things that some of which we wouldn't even agree with today, but also saying a lot of things that that we would agree with today, that even kind of pretty hardcore right wingers would not necessarily feel comfortable in expressing. And it's an indication of how much our discourse has changed in the last century, that even in the 1960s, TR was basically canceled. And his son basically says that. It's like, if my father said any of this stuff today, he'd be kind of run out of town on a, tarred and feathered. So there was a pretty dramatic change in our public culture. And if you want to see how much that is, you track down a copy of that book, or maybe some ambitious publisher will end up republishing it at some point.
Yeah, I'll probably be sending a DM real quick to a friend about, hey, you should try and get this republished. Yeah, it was published by Archibald Roosevelt, talking about
So you
his
are
work.
familiar. I should have known.
I looked it up while you were telling me about it because I had never heard of this book, and I was like, well, now I really want to get a copy of it for
Yeah.
myself. But
Yeah.
yeah, about $350. So hopefully some ambitious, independent publisher will get a hold of that. The other thing too that I really appreciated too was this your chapter on sort of green energy and the environmentalist movement, because we see it all the time with environmentalism, where basically there was it advocates for antinatalism, and it advocates for more or less self-destruction for the name of the environment, this higher, greater good ideal. And I tell people all the time, I just say, progressivism or leftism, which includes all this anti-white stuff, is just, suicidal ideation on a civilizational scale. And this chapter itself really pulls that up because, the I think it was from the Pew Research Center. They had a poll where they said 15% of self-identified, progressives and environmentalists do not have children out of concerns over climate change. And
Yeah.
regardless of whatever your position might be on the climate, to tell people outright to not engage in the most basic human activity to go forth, be fruitful, and multiply, really tells you that is just, well, for lack of a better word, I mean, it's just telling you to just kill yourself. And
Yeah.
really, it's a big part of the environmental movement. Is just, I'm going to rob you blind, tell you not to have kids, and that money is going to go to the worst polluters in the world, which tends to be the non-white, non-European world. I mean, one can look at a map of the Indian Ocean just to see how much plastic and feces are out there, and compared to the environmentalism
Yeah.
of the industrialized West.
Absolutely, and I my professional background you touched on. Well, I have written books before. I've written sort of boring academic books that I would not recommend to your listeners unless they happen to be kind of really interested in energy policy and things like that. In which case, I would recommend them. Um, so this is an area that I'm very familiar with. And what's interesting about kind of the modern contemporary environmentalism, and it's something I explore in my chapter in this book, and I expect that'll be more new information even for your more knowledgeable readers than most of my chapters, because it's something that I know a lot about the nerdy details of it, and I put some of them in the book. Is that this is a very modern phenomenon, and in fact, sort of one of the uncomfortable truths for the environmental movement. I think one of the reasons they're so hysterical in the way they are is that environmental progressivism, going back to the time of TR, was actually very pro-white coded in ways that make today's environmental movement very uncomfortable. And so you have not only folks like Theodore Roosevelt or John Muir, who, as I point out, gets canceled by the Sierra Club, which is perhaps even more extreme than um, America trying to cancel George Washington. If you understand Muir's history in the kind of the oldest and most important, arguably, grassroots environmental organization, but even kind of more on the edge, you have guys like Madison Grant, who was recently the subject of an academic biography. So Madison Grant, who wrote a book called The Passing of the Great Race, which was kind of overtly kind of racist, pro-white tract, even at the time was kind of considered very controversial, although he was friends with TR and a bunch of other very establishment people at the time. But this was very intertwined in his view with his conservationist views, and he was really one of the leading figures in early 20th century conservationism, and it was very kind of tied up in his views on race. He's not the only person, nor is TR, who kind of falls into that bucket 100 years ago of kind of combining what would have be today considered extremely reactionary views on race with extremely progressive views on the environment. And in some ways, it's due to the discomfort of that legacy within the environmental movement that they have run completely screaming in the other direction, even though, as I point out, even until quite recently, um, anti-immigration sentiment on the Sierra Club board and in the Sierra Club grassroots was very high and extremely high for a allegedly left-wing organization. So in some ways, the leadership of these groups is at war with some of their membership, and they're kind of pushing this multicultural project, this pro-immigration project through against a membership that really just cares about, like, hey, we like non-crowded national parks and lots of trees and all that type of stuff.
Yeah, when basic cleanliness and order is labeled as racist, I think it becomes very clear as to what you're up against in that respect. And
Sure.
you highlight that very clearly in both your chapter on big tech and as well as with the green movement as well. One of the things that I noticed, because I have the PDF up on the other tab here, and I'm sort of control Fing to look for some interesting words here. I noticed that intersectional is used only 5 times throughout the text, and I think that the intersectional critical theory, the DEI stuff, I think everyone sort of just takes that as part and parcel. But I don't think that the right has ever truly had a good answer to it, because, intersectionality works fantastic. I mean, for instance, you talk about the Sierra Club or anyone who's like I think of a cousin of mine. She is a single issue voter on animal rights, specifically with regards to industrial grade farming, and she gives money to PETA, and I think she has a good heart, because no, we're stewards of the earth. We're not supposed to treat animals badly. However, it doesn't matter that you're a single issue voter and you tend to vote on a progressive issue. You have to bow down to every other issue that what gets put under the intersectional umbrella. So that requires you to have all these anti-white, sort of tick marks on your membership card. That way, you, as sort of like a white liberal, can talk about a specific issue. And is for on the right in comparison. There was the idea of fusionism back in the early 50s and 60s about bringing sort of that laissez-faire marketeering with the cultural traditionalism rooted in America's Anglo-Protestant history, and that has not worked out nearly as well compared to
Right.
a politics based on envy, animus, and destruction of the other. And I mean, for you, when you talk about dismantling, and even that word is coded for all sorts of reasons. But I mean, if you wanted to just say, okay, net zero immigration, we're going to get rid of affirmative action. I mean, do you still where how far do you go, for instance, to take on the intersectional issue? Because that is sort of this. Even if people don't buy into it or they don't know what it means, any leftist activist knows exactly what that means. I have to bow down to this racial hierarchy. Everything
Right.
is incorporated. I mean, where do you see that going? I mean, because that theoretical underpinning has to be destroyed. And as our friend Orrin McIntyre likes to say, this doesn't end until there are tanks on Harvard Yard.
Yeah.
We could go further than that
Endorsed.
and just defund them and all that. But I mean, where do you see that going? Because intersectionality is still here to stay right
Yeah,
now.
it does need to be destroyed, and I'm not backing away from that fight at all. I mean, there are areas. Again, I try to maintain an even tone throughout this, but there are areas where we are going to have total war, and I don't mean that literally in terms of tanks and Harvard Yard, although who knows, maybe that does happen at some point. But that yeah, I'm not under any illusion about the nature of our enemy or the ruthlessness with which they'll fight, and we need to match that with equal ruthlessness on our side. It's interesting because one of the 5 times I mentioned intersectionality in the book is I talk about the problems of white Americans being intersectional, and by that I discuss the deaths of despair that Angus Deaton, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, and his wife, and whose name I'm blanking on, have done kind of interesting work talking about white deaths of despair, essentially from drugs and alcohol in middle age, and you began to see this huge phenomenon that I kind of compare to what happened to Native Americans 100 plus years ago as they were kind of losing their country as they saw it. And I say sort of these problems are intersectional in that it's the whiteness combined with I can't get as good a job, combined with the cultural messaging, combined with the intoxicants. And so I think in some ways there are elements to look at intersectionality that are valid from our perspective. But in terms of using it to combat the left's claims, I think we just need to be completely unapologetic that we are not going to put up with this. And again, it does come down to what I call this mutually assured destruction. They are not going to the area where I would probably, I mean, I have enormous respect for Chris Rufo's success as an activist, but where I would go a little beyond where he is I think he will only get so far. And Chris was again kind enough to blur my book by sort of making this gauzy appeal to anti-discrimination, et cetera, and color blindness. That's all great. I would love to get to that point. The only way we can possibly get to that point is by not making that type of gauzy appeal to colorblindness, because that will only get us so far with the really bad actors. What we need to do is show them that they are in for a world of pain, a world of difficulty, a world of misery if they don't disarm immediately in the face of this nice, very dangerous weapon that we are not at all unwilling to wield against them. And then if you get to a sort of mutually assured destruction position on race, then maybe kind of cooler heads begin to prevail, and we can say, hey, let's maybe move to a different way of doing things. But we're not going to just get that by being sweet about things.
I would agree with that absolutely. I think that there has been, and I know Elon Musk got in trouble for retweeting a screenshot of an older Twitter account that was just unapologetically pro-white, and it's just been saying that we're witnessing people see their destruction because they're too afraid to be mean, because that's the
Right.
alternative to what's currently going on, which she agreed with 100% because it's true.
Yeah.
There needs to be a forceful attitude that is the desire to fight on a legal and cultural front that isn't just these blank slate appeals to humanity. That I would agree with. And the other economist's name was Ann Case, because I have read on the deaths of
Thank
despair
you.
thing.
Thank you.
And I think that she and her husband are absolutely right. And I know people don't like this comparison, but I think that it's also very true because the civil rights revolution that emerged out of the 1960s, which was spearheaded by numerous actors that were not in any way, shape, or form very pro-American whatsoever. I mean,
Yeah,
the fact that it's only taken 40 years for Charlie Kirk and others at TPUSA to point out the same things that the senators who were opposed to MLK Day were talking about
right.
is incredibly depressing. Sam Francis wrote a really great article about that holiday and its meaning.
Sure.
But I would tell, I think that you compare what happened to, say, African Americans in the United States in the midst of the civil rights revolution. We've witnessed the absolute cultural genocide of an entire group of people in America. I mean,
Yeah,
you compare middle class wealth, upper middle class wealth of blacks prior to the civil rights revolution to today, and you would look at them and you'd think, wow, we killed all these people, and this is the survivors that we barely take care of. And I'm witnessing the same thing happen here, where out of wedlock births are happening at a higher rate, fatherlessness among whites is increasing, and of course the deaths of despair that are literally sponsored by the state. I mean, I don't agree with Sohrab Ahmari on just about anything, but in his book about the Tyranny Inc., which I reviewed for the Mars Review of Books, he was right to call out Sackler and Purdue for calling those people hillbillies. I mean, it is sponsored, and they kind of get off scot free with our court system. So
right.
I would say that your notion of, when you even mention it here about the notion of white genocides associated with the far right fringes, but I mean, no, there's a cultural one, and that usually includes deaths of despair and outright ethnic
Right.
animus because these people do cheer it on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say I mean, there was a lot there that I'd love to kind of get to. So I'm going to see if I can
Sure,
remember it
go
all.
for it.
For those of the folks who will be in the comments when this goes live or whatever, saying, "Oh, he's cucking on X," the thing. What I would just sort of encourage, and look, Beautiful Losers by Sam Francis. I've said this publicly. One of the most prescient books ever written about American politics in the 20th century. So there's a lot of insights that we can gain, certainly from people like that. And it is sort of discouraging that only even the vague mainstream is this kind of allowed decades later. On the other hand, I would say, regardless even of your personal views, as a political strategy, kind of again, arguing that like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was really bad is just not a useful place for us to go. The question is like, where do you go now? Okay.
Mhm.
And so that's why I say I'm not trying to relitigate it. I'm trying to say whatever the gains were that we got from it, they've long since been overwhelmed by losses that we're getting. So let's reconnoiter and do something different. You touch on white genocide, and I think arguably I'm going to do a Twitter thread on this at some point because this is actually one of the most fun parts of the book, and it's an edgy thing that I actually think we should push. Because as I was doing research for this book, I came across the work of this guy Raphael Lemkin, who is a Polish Jewish um, uh, kind of writer and lawyer who
Mhm.
comes up with the term genocide in the wake of World War II, popularizes it. But he also has this notion of cultural genocide that he pushes to a certain degree at the UN, but it just never quite catches on in the same way. But if you look at what Lemkin talks about a cultural genocide being, and this is the distributing intoxicants and tearing down cultural symbols and a variety of other things. It is basically a carbon copy of this is what's happening to white people in America today. And so I think one of the great ironies is white genocide is kind of, again, it's a thing that is on the furthest fringes of rightmost discourse in America. And yet I think that honestly, it's a reasonably fair assessment of what is going on in America today, not by my lights, but by the lights of the guy who invented the term genocide. And so I think that is um, I've never seen anybody else on the right mention this. I'm not saying that nobody has, but that was kind of some original research I did for this book, and it's something that I hope becomes more clear. Again, not because I want to be provocative or suggest that like we're being genocided, but because it just does show the level of seriousness of the plight of the white community broadly in the United States today.
Yeah, no, I would definitely agree that that is sort of the plight, which is just a cultural genocide. And I mean, I think that Americans, especially white Republican voting Americans, will notice that I mean, like we mentioned earlier, you can't be explicitly racial in sort of your politics of rewarding friends and punishing enemies, but you notice that when Trump's, the tax law that was debated in his administration, the salt taxes explicitly, those exemptions. I mean, that mainly punished urban diverse communities, whereas that would primarily benefit white red state Republican voting areas, in the same way that Trump addressing the opioid crisis and by a large extent the fentanyl crisis. I mean, that primarily, and that's sort of the way it's always been coded, because outright saying like I'm the pro-white candidate is probably not going to fly after 70 plus years of being told to think racially is to be akin
Right.
to the specter of fascism that still haunts the
Right.
Western world after World War II. But the one thing that we can maybe conclude with some pushback or some discussion on would be, I looked up, again, just Controlled F, went through some things. I noticed deportation is mentioned twice in the
Yeah.
text. Both are within a specific religious area in your chapter. About not all of them call them Lord, Lord.
Yeah.
But I know Trump has talked about on his campaign trail so far for 2024 about having deportation and
Yeah.
about trying to remove, and of course, limit legal immigration as well. And so perhaps, we've talked about, and you've been on before, and you've always, ran to me the same thing that you've heard in Congress and the administrations is, do you want to win the argument or do you want the bill? And, do you see that not being a feasible solution? I mean, there are plenty in to our friends across the pond on the right, that are literally banned from going to countries from even talking about remigration
Right.
or deportation.
Right.
Do you not see that as a viable option, or do you see perhaps a mix of both? Because at the time of this recording, I see Barry Weiss's, the Free Press, and they're debating about immigration and closing the border, and I'm
Yeah.
just thinking to myself, well, are you guys debating aggressive or passive aggressive deportation? Which one is it
Yeah.
going to be? But that's obviously not what they're debating.
So part of it's just a coincidence, like in terms of dimension. I mean, I've written a lot about immigration. I have always been extraordinarily hawkish on the immigration question, as anybody who's read me for years knows. I have no problem. I love that Trump is talking about mass deportations, and we should do that. Um, but I mean, then okay, so we now have to qualify what that means a little bit, right?
Hmm.
Because to me, that means people who are not here legally, right? Um, and so that's the people you're A, not letting in, and B, I don't care how long they've been there, we're deporting them. That in and of itself, let's be honest, that's a huge fight, particularly for some illegal who's been here 30 years or something like that. Okay. So just even getting to that, let's again being realistic. If we did nothing but close the border and deport people who are here illegally, um, that would be a huge, huge win in the current political context.
Hmm.
You touched on this remigration question. I followed a little bit. Lauren Southern had this Twitter thread, which I assume is what you're referring to,
Well,
and
I'm referring to Mr. Martin Sellner,
Martin
who had,
Sellner and what happened
yeah.
with Brittany, and that's I mean that's how I saw it most
Okay. Yeah.
recently.
Well, I've started reading his work on the question as well, and
Yeah.
he's
So
trying to feasibly address that question too.
so my view is like I'm glad that we live in a country where, unlike Europe, people can advocate for that. I can't say that I thought super deeply about it. I don't even know what it would mean. I think if you are thinking, and this is again where I will hit the furthest fringes of the right, if you're thinking that you're somehow going to march people out at gunpoint or even anything remotely analogous to that in 2024 America because they don't share your cultural or ethnic or racial background, I think you're kidding yourself in a really serious and dangerous way. If there are things that are short of that, that I don't know, they're dual citizens who you're like, hey, we're going to really crack down on dual citizenship and you've got to figure out which one you want. Or, I mean, if they're intermediate things, I'm happy to discuss that. If people on the furthest fringes of the right want to push for this to somehow become a viable political issue, it's a free country and they should have the right to do that. And all it really underscores to me is that I view my solutions to these things as responsible, moderate solutions. We've sort of been stuck in, oh, well, we're this far right. I actually kind of want to push back on that. I'm like, no, I'm just a common sense, patriotic American who would like to keep America American.
We're all sensible centrists here, Mr.
Right, it's
Carl.
all sensible centrists. Nothing but that. Um, I am fully pro deportation of illegals, and I think if we did that and closed the border, that would be a huge win. I'm going to spend my personal time, rather than focusing on remigration of anybody but maybe some dual citizens beyond that, focusing on an American ethnogenesis and a closed border. If other people want to go beyond that, again, like, that's great. They can do that. I'm not really sure that I'm not super optimistic they're going to have a lot of success, and it wouldn't be where I'd choose to spend my time. But again, that's their right to do that. And I'm glad we don't live in Europe where you get thrown into jail for that. Although, of course, there are some people who would probably be happy to do that, and have certainly oppressed people who have spoken out on these issues. So I don't want to minimize that.
I was about to say, I mean, even at the beginning when you wanted to title your book, "It's Okay to Be White," I mean, a British nationalist has been arrested and jailed for putting up stickers that say exactly that. So, I mean, we do have, I mean, well, that's a big difference between us and our friends across the pond, is that we do have a more federal and, of course, an enumerated, right for free speech to some extent here in the United States with the First Amendment. But as we're coming up on time here, Mr. Carl, is there why should we buy this book? I mean, a lot of my audience might look at this and say, well, I kind of already know this and take it for granted, but why should I buy the book? Why should I read the text? And outside of just give us your pitch.
Yeah, so I mean, a few things. One is, there are going to be things like Raphael Lemkin and cultural genocide, and maybe if you know about that, maybe you don't need to buy the book. But there are going to be things, even for the most edgelordy person who's on this listening to this, you are not going to know. And I think it also, what it's done is it maybe takes issues that sort of listener is going to be interested in, and says, okay, here's me. I'm a mainstream person. I have participated in very mainstream politics. Like, how do we package this up and do this in a way that is actually practical for America in 2024, and not, a frog just out there kind of venting on Twitter, but not necessarily going anywhere. Finally, I'd say, even if you're not convinced, ultimately, if you're like, I care about these issues, I'm not sure about this Carl guy and Claremont Institute. When you buy this, and by the way, I will not see a penny from you buying this for a long time, just because of the way royalties work for books. I've got to earn out my advance. So it's not a financial thing for me at all at this point. It does send a signal that this is a legitimate subject for a mainstream book, for a mainstream publisher who's taking a risk, right, in doing a book like this. Okay. And if it sells, they're like, oh, well, that Carl guy's book showed there's an audience for that. And it will encourage other people, maybe people who will be right in your wheelhouse about how to think about these issues. Oh, they can write a book too, and it can get published by a mainstream publisher, because the mainstream publisher sees there's an audience for this sort of material and for this sort of subject matter. And so that would be my real pitch for why even your kind of most informed listeners should do it. But they can also buy it for mom and dad, who are maybe not as kind of versed in these issues, and it won't scare them away. They won't be like, oh my God, you just gave me a book by a crazy person. No, this book has been endorsed by Tucker. It's been endorsed by Charlie Kirk. It's been endorsed by Victor Davis Hanson, Heather McDonald, the longest serving member of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Like, a lot of very mainstream people have kind of said, hey, you know what? Maybe this Carl guy is onto something. So that would be my pitch for why people should buy it and read it. And I think they get a lot out of it.
Jeremy, where can people find you, and what are your prospects, and what are your projects for the future?
Sure. You can find me on X at Real Jeremy Carl, and I try to tweet there a lot. So always appreciate those follows. I have a relatively new Substack called The Course of Empire. Currently, it's at jeremycarl.substack.com. I may actually just switch that domain name, but if you just search for my Substack, you'll find it there, and doing a lot of kind of regular posting on this. I am I met the American Mind, American Greatness, the American Conservative, all those sorts of things. If you're following my Substack and Twitter, you'll never miss any of those sorts of things because I'm featuring them all there. In terms of future projects, it'll partially depend on, again, my pitch for buying this book. How well does the book go? But what I'd like to do, and what I've sort of started in on, is a sequel that specifically looks at liberal whites as kind of the great Satan here in some ways, and looks at various communities of liberal whites and gets into, potentially some taboo territory. I'll leave that a little bit unsaid, but I think your perceptive readers or listeners will be able to kind of maybe guess at some of that. But really kind of looks at why has the white left gone as crazy as it has, and we can actually statistically document just how crazy they've become on these issues, and what are the implications of that, and how can we marginalize these people and basically make sure that they are not the people running the political debate. So I think that's kind of the big sequel that I'd love to do, because the thing I'm kind of trying to do in this book is, to give a lot of information, even for some of your high information people, but also just to convince people that the problem even exists. And again, your listeners don't need to be convinced of that, but like the normie does. So like step one is like the problem exists and we can do something about it. My book two is kind of to try to look at a little bit some of these groups that are really pushing this, particularly within the white community, and like why they've gone so off the rails and what we can do about them to kind of stop them from running our lives here in America. So I think that'll be my sequel, and certainly I think if this book is received well and with a lot of interest, we'll see that get out into publication hopefully sooner rather than later.
Well, thank you. I'm looking forward to it, and I know this will come out later, but I would highly recommend that people look up your Substack on Mackenzie Scott and where those billions of dollars are going. I covered it recently with Patrick Casey on his show, and it was. I'm a grant writer by trade in the normie world, so it was really fun to just sort of break down how awful the NGO grant complex is. So it's a really good piece. I'd recommend people read it. But Jeremy Carl, thank you so much for coming on. Your links and the links to this book will be down below in the description, and hopefully my review will be out around the time that the book drops.
Thanks so much, and I really appreciate the opportunity to come on and talk to you and your audience.
All right, thanks so much.